Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. You know, this is a discussion and debate that I think sometimes gives way to caricature. It gives way to two different extremes and poles. That there are some in the political world who seem to advocate that we should stay in Syria forever and attempt to remake that country as a democratic utopia in our image. There are others who seem to advocate that we should immediately and precipitously withdraw. I tend to think the American people agree with neither of those poles, that neither of them are right or accurate and make sense, and that the touchstone of our foreign policy should be the vital national security interest of the United States. I think it is worth pausing to recognize that the defeat of ISIS, taking away their so-called caliphate, is an extraordinary national security victory for the United States and something for which the Trump administration and the brave men and women in our armed services deserve enormous credit for winning that victory. I also agree with the President's ultimate objective of bringing our soldiers home. I think the American people have a limited time and patience for our sons and daughters being in harm's way. That being said, I think the way this decision was executed was precipitous and risked very serious negative consequences. The two that are most problematic in terms of how this decision was executed is, number one, I am concerned there is a substantial possibility of ISIS returning. There are right now some 15,000 ISIS fighters who remain in Iraq and Syria. And pulling out without an effective counterterrorism strategy, presence, and platform to combat those fighters risks those fighters ultimately attacking United States citizens and endangering our national security. Secondly, I think the way we announced the withdrawal risked abandoning the Kurds to military onslaught and potentially even the threat of a genocide. I think the Kurds have a long history of standing with America against our enemies, of risking their lives to stand with America against our enemies. And were the United States to sit back while Turkey attempted to slaughter the Kurds, I think that would be nothing short of disgraceful. So given that, Ambassador Jeffrey, I want to ask initially, do we know right now, since this announcement was made, how many ISIS fighters have been released or are at jeopardy of being released?
Again, a relatively small number appear to have escaped of actual detainees as opposed to people that we worry about who are internally displaced persons, mainly adult females that were married to ISIS fighters. So the number is relatively small. We're always worried.
Can you quantify relatively small?
I would say in the dozens at this point. I mean, there are various accounts out there, but there's a lot of propaganda both from the Turkish side and from the other side. On
dozens of ISIS fighters?
Dozens of ISIS fighters, perhaps. I can think of one incident where 5 supposedly fled, and there have been a couple of other rumors that we're looking into. The problem is that under these circumstances, we don't have the same eyes on that we normally did. But all ISIS, I want to be clear, all ISIS detainees are in jeopardy if things go south in northeast Syria of somehow escaping or overwhelming their guards. That's one of the key priorities.
How many ISIS detainees are we talking about?
About 10,000.
About 10,000. Let me ask you about the Kurds. Do we know how many Kurds have been killed since Turkey began the onslaught?
I think there's been some hundreds of casualties, but we don't have direct numbers because communications are not all that great between the people in the field and the
By casualties, do you mean injuries or deaths, or what visibility do we have?
I would put it as killed and wounded.
Killed and wounded. Let me ask, what happens, as I understand it, the ceasefire expires in 9 minutes under the terms of it. What happens in 9 minutes?
It expired 2 hours ago.
Oh, okay. Well.
But what happens under the agreement is, first of all, we can't call it a ceasefire for Turkish sensitivities vis-a-vis the other partner, which is not a state, but a a sub-state organization, and in their eyes, a terrorist one. So we call it a pause. And at the end of that pause, if both sides, the Turks and the YPG, agree that everything that was agreed has been accomplished, then the pause goes into a halt of Turkish forces. And then we then lift our sanctions that we levied when the Turks went in 2 weeks ago. So that's the plan.
So, Ambassador, when this decision was announced, I was traveling in Asia and was in Japan and Taiwan and India and Hong Kong. And repeatedly traveling amongst our allies, I faced the question. I faced the question in Taiwan. I faced the question in India, that if America won't stand with the Kurds, that if we won't keep our word to the Kurds, why should we, other friends and allies, trust that America will stand with us? How should we answer those friends and allies?
Yeah, I've heard that too, Senator, and everybody around me has.
Yeah.
I would put it this way, and it gets back to the consultations. I was consulted by President Trump on what to do after this happened. And I was one of the people who put together the plan, supported fully by President Trump, to impose these very harsh sanctions on Turkey immediately. Secondly, if we talk about a green light, to green light the action by the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives to impose even stronger sanctions.
Let me ask a final question just because my time's expired and I want to. What confidence can we have that America will not abandon the Kurds who have stood with us repeatedly at great peril to themselves?
We have used dramatic, diplomatic, political, and economic tools, which are normally the right tools, short of war, to reverse this decision. And at this point, as we look at this ceasefire, I think we've done a pretty good job in bringing the conflict, this attack to a halt.
Okay, thank you.